Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which introduces the Our Digital Ancestors project, which is a new project for Caring for God's Acre, where we'll primarily be working in Church of England churchyards, but also other burial grounds all across England. And we thought we'd have this webinar today to talk to you about why we're excited about the project and what we can learn from memorials, especially the stories that memorials can tell us about our ancestors. You may have noticed that I'm using automatic subtitles provided by PowerPoint to aid accessibility. So I apologise for any errors which might occur. It tends to do fairly well with my accent, but we've discovered it doesn't do that well with some of the place names, especially the French ones. So apologies in advance for that. So my name is Dr. Josie Wall, and I've just been appointed as the project manager for the Our Digital Ancestors project by Caring for God's Acre. And I'm really excited to be running this social history and built heritage project for the charity because it builds on my experience in the heritage sector over the last 10 years. Some of you I have encountered in previous roles when I was working for the Coffin Works Museum, or when I was working on the Jewellery Quarter Cemeteries project, or as part of the work I did assisting Caring for God's Acre with a previous project called Celebrating Birmingham's Beautiful Burial Grounds. I love memorials and recording memorials and all of the things that they can tell us about people's lives. And I did lots of that during my PhD when I was researching Victorian cemeteries. So the Our Digital Ancestors project will include burial grounds of all kinds in England. And I'm going to start with a very whistle-stop explanation of our burial grounds and the monuments that we find in them. The vast majority of the burial spaces we have in England are still parish churchyards, which have been our main place of burial for a very long time, really since the widespread adoption of Christianity in the British Isles. Although in recent times, in urban areas, larger cemeteries have come to dominate the burial landscape. In rural areas, there are still many churchyards serving their parish in the same way they always have. So let's take it back to basics. What is a churchyard? A possible definition of a churchyard is the enclosed area around the church, which is usually bounded by a wall used for burial. Most churchyards in England are rectangular, but we do see some oval or circular ones, which implies an older origin. The one on the screen on the left-hand side here is from All Saints in Branham in the York Diocese. This was one of the pilot sites which AG International mapped in 2020. And as you can see, it's an oval churchyard. There's been an ancient site on this church, ancient church on this site, since at least 915 AD, and the present church construction of that began in 1150 AD. Now, it wouldn't be a Caring for God's Acre webinar without me mentioning that churchyards are hugely valuable for biodiversity. They are little pockets of surviving ancient grassland which have remained largely unaltered as the agricultural land around them has changed. Generally, there's very few pesticides used in churchyards. Generally, in the past, they weren't grazed, which is one of the reasons that we get so many yew trees in cemeteries. And an interesting feature of our older churchyards is that the soil level is usually higher inside them than outside of the churchyard, because the volume of burials has raised up the soil level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Usually there's a scattering of gravestones around, and of all different kinds and ages, but it's quite rare to find any stones which are older than the 18th century. So why would that be? Well, not every grave in a churchyard is marked by a gravestone, especially not in the past. For centuries, it was assumed that graves would be reused about once a generation. The most popular sites within the churchyard were those to the south and east side of the church, where you would have a view of dawn on Judgment Day. And because of that, the north side of the church was less popular for burials. So you would find that first used for the burials of strangers, non-members of the congregation and things like that. But eventually the whole churchyard would become full, and then you would start to reuse older graves. The graves that were reused, if there was any bones remaining in them, those might be reburied deeper at the bottom of a new grave, or they might be cleared into a charnel pit or a charnel house within the churchyard. And this system worked fine for a really long time, because the graves that were in living memory didn't need to be marked, because their loved ones and their neighbours and other members of the congregation would know where that grave was. And once somebody passed beyond living memory, then the grave would be used again. We've got a lovely example of a churchyard cross here. And it's thought that one of the uses of churchyard crosses that we find in many parts of the country, as well as for outdoor preaching and things like that, was that they also served as collective memorials to the dead. They indicated that the churchyard was a sacred space set aside for burial. But in the 21st century, most new graves in churchyards are marked with a memorial. So how, why, and when did this change? The first memorials we see, the oldest memorials we see, are usually inside the church. And burial inside the church was reserved for certain members of society. The clergy would be buried in the church, and also the local nobility would be buried inside their local church. The most sought after grave spaces locations were those which were closest to an altar, seen as being closest to God and the saints. Before the Reformation, the landed gentry would have chantry chapels in their local church, and a chantry chapel is where there is an altar for saying prayers, saying masses for the soul, to speed passage through purgatory. And we don't see those post-Reformation, but we still see the family tombs, which sometimes are quite elaborate monuments. Sometimes they take the form of legistones in the floor, and sometimes we see more wall memorials, like the ones that we've got here on the walls of St Mary's Church in Whitby. And over the centuries, churches were often extended and reorganised to accommodate graves and memorials, but the space is finite. So over time, we do start to see those who want to have a family memorial constructing them in the churchyard over a family vault. The earliest styles mimic those of the church monuments. So we see chest tombs, we see ledger slabs, and we see the wall memorials being reimagined as headstones. This starts a fashion for churchyard monuments, which expands to more people as society changes. As we move away from the feudal system and towards a society in which there is a larger middle class with more people with disposable income, they start investing in gravestones. And in the early period, these were often made by local stonemasons. Often they were carving small headstones. The designs might be quite simple or crudely carved, and we see a lot of regional and local styles of memorials around the country. And these memorials help graves locations endure beyond living memory, but they're not affordable for everyone, and they're not always practical everywhere. This is especially true as the Industrial Revolution changes population patterns, with more people moving away from the countryside to find work in towns and cities. And we know that this led to a lot of overcrowding and unsanitary conditions for the living, but it also created those same problems for the dead. So you see churchyards that were designed to provide enough grave space for reuse every 40 or 50 years, once a generation, now attempting to reuse graves every 4 or 5 years or even sooner. And predictably, this had unpleasant consequences. One of which being that we see a very rapid rise in soil levels around urban churches. The map on the screen here is of the centre of Birmingham, and the oldest church, the original parish church of Birmingham, is in the bottom left. That's St Martin's Church, which is marked with a red line. And William Hutton, who was the first historian of Birmingham, wrote in 1780 and said, "Through a long course of interment, the churchyard is augmented into a considerable hill. We may therefore safely remark in this place that the dead are raised up. The growth of soil causes a low appearance to the building, so that instead of the church burying the dead would have in time buried the church." Now, St Martin's Parish did attempt to address this problem. They opened a chapel of ease at St Bartholomew's, which is marked with the blue line towards the top of the map, and that was useful for more space for the congregation, but also it did provide an additional burial ground as well. And then they did also open a churchyard extension, a detached churchyard extension on Park Street, which is marked with the green lines. So lots of urban churches were attempting to solve this problem, but in the centre of towns and cities where space is at a premium, it could be quite difficult. So you would have a situation where graves were still being reused far too often, and it's said that the soil would become exhausted, so nothing would grow in the churchyards, and this was especially true where lye had been added to try and speed up decomposition. So you'd have bare earth, you might have scattered bones around if shallow burials had been disturbed, especially by scavenging birds and animals. Dickens described this really well with his image of the Church of Ghastly Grim, which is supposed to be inspired by St Olave's, which is pictured here with the 3 skulls above the entrance to the churchyard. And it was understood that there were public health consequences to the state of churchyards. This is a pre-germ theory era, so it was believed that it was the bad air, the miasmas, which were erupting from the graves, which were causing people to become sick. And also these churchyards, especially the unattended extensions away from the main church, were a really prime target for body snatchers because you've got a lot of unmarked shallow graves, and at this time there was a huge demand for bodies from medical schools, and the number that they required for dissection outstripped the legitimate supply, which at the time was only the bodies of executed criminals. So there was a lot of change needed to the way we were burying people in towns and cities to prevent moral outcry and a public health disaster. The first city that really tried to solve the problem on a systematic scale in Europe was in Paris. This is the post-revolutionary period, and we see state attempts to fix the problems for all Parisians. So churchyards within the city limits were closed. Remains were removed from them and reinterred in the catacombs underneath the city. And the state officials proposed new burial grounds called Fields of Rest beyond the city limits. This plan was eventually realised in the form of 4 large cemeteries at the compass points around Paris, starting with Père Lachaise to the east of the city. And we see that all of these cemeteries were laid out on a garden cemetery model. So although the original proposals had been more strictly egalitarian, these new cemeteries did retain, importantly, the right to a single grave burial for everybody for a minimum of 10 years. And the state would provide this grave space and included the right to erect a temporary memorial over the grave. But if you had money, you could purchase a longer grave concession, including perpetual ones. Those could be purchased, and as long as the memorial was maintained, the burial would never be removed and the grave wouldn't be reused. So we've originally got a landscape inspired by the English gardens of the Romantic movement. You've got winding pathways leading to interesting vistas. We've got lots of naturalistic planting and scattered memorials, as you can see in this engraving from 1848. But unfortunately, this vision didn't last very long, because the popularity of purchased concessions and erected monuments over them altered the landscape. So today, if you've visited it, Père Lachaise has got far more of the appearance of a city of the dead than it does of a garden. But this garden cemetery model inspired similar cemeteries across Europe and across North America. In the UK, the first ones tended to be privately owned, often by joint stock companies. So they had shareholders, and they were profit-making bodies. So these are not burial spaces that are open to everybody. Often there was a religious freedom motivation as well as a public health one. A lot of the early joint stock cemetery companies were founded by nonconformists, non-Anglican Christians who were looking for burial space that wasn't controlled by the established church. And so we've got a situation where, contrary to the French cemeteries, which were state-owned and included a minimum standard of burial for everybody, the first British cemeteries were aimed mostly at the middle classes and the upper classes who could afford to pay for a family grave and a memorial, and therefore escape from having to be buried in the local overcrowded churchyard. Where the working classes could afford burial in these cemeteries at all, it would be in public or common graves. So they would be buried alongside other people who died around the same time as them, rather than with their families. Grave reuse had become socially unacceptable, and so the solution in Britain, rather than, as we see in France, with a 10-year lease and subsequent grave reuse, in British cemeteries we see large, deep public graves for multiple burials. Some of the cemeteries have collective memorials on their public graves, and others of them left them unmarked, and often those would be all in a row and then grassed over and used as a pathway for navigating the cemetery once those graves were full. Luckily for us, though, burial reforms continued, and we start to see the provision of municipal cemeteries to supplement churchyards. And these municipal cemeteries include options for the burial of all denominations and all local residents, including pauper burial, where there aren't existing suitable options for that. And this was a much better funding model, because we're still feeling the after effects of the joint stock cemeteries model, because none of those companies invested their income to ensure that there would be maintenance after they ran out of grave space to sell. And so most of them went bankrupt in the early 20th century. And so I'm very glad that the vast majority of British cemeteries are actually not formed on that model. Municipal cemeteries, as I say, had to provide burial for everybody, but like the private cemeteries, purchased graves did also now come with the right to erect a memorial, and that reflects a desire for gravestones within the population. So during the 19th century, we see a huge proliferation in the styles and forms of monuments, many of them being inspired by wider architectural fashions. We've got neoclassical monuments, Gothic revival, Celtic revival, Egyptian. And as the industry becomes more professionalized and commercialized, we see the regional styles largely disappear. Instead, local masons can buy manufactured blanks, which customers choose from a catalogue, and then add their own inscriptions. Over time, we also see less use of local stone because improvements in transport, especially the railway network, make it more affordable to import stone. So we start to see Scottish and Cornish granites more frequently, and also Italian marble and things like that becoming more affordable over time during the 19th century. So as more graves are marked with memorials, we're no longer as reliant on the official records to tell us where and how people lived and died. We also have these monuments with the words and symbols chosen by the people who knew them to help us tell their stories. So both burial registers and monuments have been used as a source for family history and genealogy for a long time. And there's been a number of academic studies looking at burial grounds as well. Most of those either use some samples from a number of sites, or they use all of the records or all of the memorials from one burial ground. What we're starting to see now with the National Burial Ground Survey is something that is unique in its scope, in the ambition of the size of the project. So the National Burial Grounds survey is leading on from the previous work that was done to create the Church Heritage Record, which some of you may be familiar with. That's an online resource which includes mapping the location of every Church of England church and the locations of their burial grounds. There are tabs with information about the each of those sites. And Caring for God's Sake are very pleased to say that this also includes ecological information about the churchyards, information about veteran and ancient trees that's pulled through, records from the NBN Atlas about species which have been recorded there are pulled through to the Church Heritage Record. And we've also, it links to things like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for information about war graves, and to Historic England records about any listed structures as well. So this is a precursor to the National Burial Ground Survey, which is now starting, that will look at burial grounds in more detail. This project is being run in partnership between the Church of England and a surveying company called AG International, who used to be known as Atlantic Geomatics. Participation in the National Burial Ground Survey is available to any Church of England church who want to get involved in the project, and there is no cost to be involved. So every site which takes part will get a digital map of their churchyard showing the layout and marking the location of all of the gravestones. Also the locations of other fixed features such as pathways, benches, and trees are marked on the survey. And then every gravestone is also photographed. Alongside this, the burial registers are scanned in, and those are matched to the gravestones or burials of a known location. And for graves which are unmarked, the burial registers are still attached to the churchyard. So you can still search by name or date for people buried within the site. It's just that their exact grave location will only be marked on the map if that is known. The survey is conducted using a sensor array, which is worn as a backpack. So the surveyor comes out onto site and walks over all of the areas of the site, recording it, and that can then be converted into a digital map. And then alongside that, you also have the burial registers and any other useful documents being scanned in. Usually those are held by a local archive, but sometimes there are still records held within the parish as well. As I said, the project doesn't cost the Church of England any money, but one of the ways it's financially viable for AG as the surveying company is that these scanned records are valuable. They will be available to purchase, for example, by genealogical companies like Ancestry, because the records which are currently available online were digitized from the microfiche, so they tend to be quite low quality scans, difficult to read. So high quality images will be useful and sought after. The finished map for each churchyard is available to view and search for free online, and once the map is finished, a URL is generated, and that can be added to the church website, the church heritage record, etc. And churches can have the admin access to keep their maps updated with new burials and new memorials, and to decide what information goes onto the public portal. So if there's any very new graves or anything that's very sensitive that's been photographed, those things can be excluded from what's available publicly. So hopefully this will be a really efficient tool for parishes to manage their churchyard and maintain burial records. And it can have lots of other uses. So it's not only helpful with planning, for example, future churchyard management and where there is still grave space to be reserved. It can also be used to help visitors find relatives' graves, provide information for faculty applications and churchyard management plans and things like that, as well as being a secure digital backup of the parish registers, which might be more conveniently located than going down to the archives to look at them. We're really excited about the possibilities of this project as an asset for research, education, the fact that it can aid with the management of biodiversity in churchyards. There's lots of really exciting possibilities with this project. So for the sites which have the public portal, the gravestone photographs and burial registers will be free to view, but they will be watermarked copies. If the you'd have to pay to purchase if you wanted to download an unwatermarked copy of those records. The images that I've shown on these last couple of slides are from paid clients whose surveys were completed before the National Burial Grounds Survey began. And we at Caring for God's Acre also worked with AG International to map 5 burial grounds in Birmingham when we did the Celebrating Birmingham's Beautiful Burial Grounds project. So we'll be sharing some images from those later in the project as well. So within England, there are 17,500 Church of England churchyards. And as many of the parishes who want to join the project will be able to do so over the coming years. So far, the actual surveying going out to do the mapping with the sensor array has been completed in the Diocese of Carlisle and Truro, where all the permissions were completed. But it will be a little while still until we have access to online portals for those maps, because there's a lot of other things that have to be done before they're ready. So all of the gravestones have to be photographed. all of the registers have to be scanned in, and then there has to be transcription of those registers and matching them up to the monuments. And all of those things take time. So we are very excited about the possibilities of the National Burial Ground Survey, and those maps will be a big part of the starting point for our project, for Caring for God's Acres project, Our Digital Ancestors, which is running between now and 2028. So this is a 4-year project, and we've got 2 staff working on it. We've got myself and we've got Dr. Rachel Askew, who should be in the chat today, so we can say hello to her at the end. We're really excited about teaching local volunteers and parishes all over England to use the maps that are generated by this project and to enrich them as well, because this system has the capacity to store much more information about the memorials and the people that are commemorated by them. So we're going to be teaching memorial recording and photography, and we're also going to be giving people the skills to do both online and archival research that will help enrich the records. So we'll be offering digital support, and that will be available to every burial ground in England, whether they're existing Atlantic Geomatic AG clients, whether they're attached to a Church of England churchyard, or whether they are representing another kind of burial ground. So we'll have lots of digital support, including webinars like this one. We'll have an online training course, which will take you through things like how to use the map, how to do online research. And we'll also be offering one-to-one support calls with sites on the best way to use the system or the kinds of research that they want to do for their project. We'll also be visiting lots of places around the country where the mapping is completed. So we'll be going out to not just National Burial Ground Survey clients, but also others who are using the AG system. There is some local authority cemeteries in Sunderland being mapped, so that's an exciting opportunity. But we'll definitely be also visiting every diocese where mapping is completed during the next 4 years. And the little map on the left-hand side of this screen shows the areas of England that we're likely to be visiting first, where most progress has been made with the National Burial Ground Survey. And whilst we're traveling, we will be running workshops about memorial recording, about how to use the map. We'll arrange archive visits, and we will also run workshops with schools as well. So we're really excited about the potential of these maps. I've picked a record here from one of the existing maps, and it just shows how useful they can be, especially, for example, if you were planning to visit the churchyard and find a grave. So you can search by name, you can search by date, and once you've found the grave that you're interested in, you can see that we have their dates of death and the names of everybody who's interred in this grave. We also have scans of the burial register, which often gives us additional information about the people. And we also have photographs of the gravestone. So on this particular monument, there are multiple photographs because there are inscriptions on different sides of it. But Atlantic Geomatic will provide at least one photograph for each grave. But we could also get a project where volunteers adding additional photographs to the system, for example, focusing on carvings and symbolism, or mason's marks, which might be hidden in the corner or on the back of the stone, things like that. That would be a great project for some keen amateur photographers. We also have within the system a space for transcribing the full inscription on the stone. And you can see an example of that on the bottom right of the screen here, where a gravestone has been transcribed. And it's really important that we do this because gravestones do unfortunately not last forever in all circumstances. Many of them do get weathered over time, become harder to read. Sometimes they're just inaccessible, either because people don't have the mobility to get to that site or because of maintenance of the churchyard, and they can become damaged for various reasons. For example, this photograph was taken in Handsworth in St Mary's churchyard when a storm brought down several trees, and actually there were a number of gravestones unfortunately damaged by those falling trees. Many parishes have an existing record of gravestone inscriptions, which has been gathered by volunteers or local historians over the years. And actually, we were very lucky that this was the case at Handsworth in St Mary's. Although actually this particular area where the trees fell had been rechecked, because the volunteer team at St Mary's have a copy of a survey from the 1980s, and they are going through comparing that to the memorials that are standing today and then uploading it onto the system. So you can see that part of that inscription is in brackets because although it was legible on the original survey, it has since been lost. And the team there are being quite systematic. They are, this is a large closed churchyard now managed by the local authority. So the volunteer team are following the route of the community payback team and going in to check memorial condition and inscriptions in areas where the vegetation has recently been cut back. And you can see that there is a section for inspections on this system, and that is where the condition of the stone and the inscription can be recorded, and that can be really helpful in lots of ways. But for example, if a parish were planning to fundraise for repair works, you could target the ones that were most in need of repair by checking the inspections records for them. We can also add lots of other kinds of information to the records. We can record the type of gravestone, the material it's made from, and that can give you really interesting trends over time. For example, more granite in the 20th century, fewer obelisks than the 19th century, for example. And we can also use the records that we gather here as a jumping point for more research, whether that's done online or in the archives, into the lives of the people that are buried there. So we could look for people on the census, we could find their address on local maps, we could look up their will, we could search for them in newspaper records, and we can add all of this information into the database. We can attach photos of historical documents, and we can add information onto the system. So I just picked a grave in Bramwood End Cemetery in Birmingham, which has been recorded by the Friends of Bramwood End there, and discovered that one of the people commemorated, John Bowen. It lists his address as Rochford House in Moseley, and I've looked into this and discovered that that house was located on the corner of Edgbaston Road. Unfortunately, it has since been demolished, and I couldn't find a photograph of the house, but as I say, I did find it on some older OS maps. And I was also able to look up more information about John Bowen. The Balsall Heath History Society had published a blog post about him. So not only do we now know that he was a JP, a Justice of the Peace, as is listed on his gravestone, but we also know that he was a builder responsible for many of the important civic buildings in Birmingham city centre on Corporation Street. So all of this kind of information can be stored in the system and can be referred back to by the Friends group and by the public in the future. So it's really exciting, the things that we'd be able to do as part of the Our Digital Ancestors project. So at the moment, whilst we're waiting for some more sites to be completed and have their public portals ready, hopefully the first ones in Carlisle Diocese will be completed soon. We are ramping up the work that we're doing in Birmingham with the sites from the Celebrating Birmingham's Beautiful Burial Grounds project, where we have existing volunteers and new opportunities for people. And of course, we'll be building our online training courses, which will be available to all of you. If you want more information about the project, there is a lot on our website under the Our Digital Ancestors project pages. But if you're a Church of England church who might be involved in the National Burial Ground Survey and you've got questions about how that will work, there's also a really good set of FAQs on the AG International website. So I suggest you check that out as well. But if you're just interested in our work, what Caring for God's Acre are doing, the project pages on the website have got loads more information, and there's also places on there to sign up for our newsletter and to express your interest in in-person or remote volunteering opportunities. And of course, none of this would be possible. The Our Digital Ancestors project would not be taking place if it wasn't for the generous funding that we've received. So we have to say thank you today to the Heritage Fund and the National Lottery Players, and also to the funding that we've received from Historic England via the UK government, and of course the in-kind contributions and donations that we've received from AG International and also from the Church of England. So without all of those things, this project wouldn't be possible.